minutes for January 13th and 15th. You should have received those from Tyler. We do not have a quorum, so. We do not, so we will have to wait and see if we get a quorum here in a moment. So we will put that to the end of the agenda. We will move to a presentation and discussion about NGO transparency. This has been an issue that we've talked about for a while, and we're going to start digging in. And we have Elena Gonzalez, data analysis with the Cicero Institute on WebEx.
Hi there.
Welcome. Thank you for being here. Look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. Do you have the presentation in front of you?
We do.
Fantastic. Okay. Good morning. I'm Elena, and I'm here with the Cicero Institute to present on, as you said, transparency and accountability across NGOs and state agencies from appropriation to the final results that those public dollars deliver. I'd like to thank the Committee of Government Efficiency and especially Chairwoman Erickson for having me here today. And thank you for your commitment to efficiency, transparency, and accountability. While I'm eager to share our current efforts here at the Cicero Institute, we're also grateful for the opportunity to hear feedback and learn more about your efforts here in Kansas. I'm part of a team that has been working to increase transparency measures with the aim of ultimately improving accountability across state governments, from program outcomes to accounting and audits. Within the last year, one of my colleagues worked at the Texas DOJ, so your equivalent here in Texas, to build out a risk-based audit and flagging algorithm to identify the riskiest payments, which auditors were then able to investigate. And some of those payments, while they raised flags initially, they had reasonable explanations, but even asking agencies to provide more information in these cases builds the expectations that auditors are using their oversight. And more recently, we have been partnering with Texas to build out an internal transparency portal for legislators to look at over 3 million payments, linking them back to their appropriations fund and all steps in between. The core of what I'll be covering today boils down to, first, that end-to-end transparency is not expensive. And this looks like standardizing record keeping across agencies, having bulk downloadable and machine readable files, dashboards for citizens, and every payment tied to an appropriation intent, and where relevant, a contract. And although that sounds like a lot, it is possible, and other states have done this for 20 to 30,000. The second point I'd like to highlight is that pay for performance measures reassert legislative oversight by requiring that outcomes are measurable. While we typically see narrative reporting, what we instead want to see are measurable and auditable outcomes. And we also want grant awardees and vendors to be incentivized to deliver well. And in both of these cases, the opportunities to leverage available data across agencies to track outcomes and payments, and then tying them back to their respective appropriations, enhances transparency for the agencies themselves first, the legislature, and then also the general public. Most auditing concerns compliance, yet even within the resource constraints of discretionary auditing, there's little incentive for the auditing body to identify waste, fraud, and abuse. But rewarding an auditing body or even a private sector body who identifies waste, fraud, and abuse will ultimately save the state money. So at a high level, the problem in this regard that state legislatures have is a means of measuring the performance of the funds they dispense. And legislative intent is the bedrock of democratic accountability in public spending, because it makes clear who authorized the funds for what purpose and on what terms, so that taxpayers can trace dollars from appropriation to recipient and judge whether agencies executed the public's directives. Turning to the next slide. There are two basic principles of management at play when we consider measuring performance. We want the state to be getting high quality outcomes for the right price, and we want public agencies to be doing the right things relative to their stated objectives, as well as the reason for appropriated funds. And these principles are intuitive, but they depend on visibility as a prerequisite. Today, legislatures often lack the visibility to assess either as effectively as possible, and this committee is well positioned to build that visibility and institutionalize it for Kansas. So the fix is end-to-end transparency, the next slide. The core claim I want to advance today is straightforward, and that is the lever that creates real oversight visibility is end-to-end transparency. And this means being able to trace a public dollar from appropriation to award to payment to use of funds, and finally to the measurable outcome delivered. While other policy measures may improve outcomes and reduce waste in the near term, end-to-end visibility mitigates against bureaucratic inertia, mission drift, or reversions to the status quo that spawn inefficiencies or ineffectiveness. And fiscal transparency in the US remains partial and uneven. The US Public Interest Research Group Following the Money series helped spur the creation of state transparency portals. And they identified persistent fragmentation, inconsistent data standards, and limited statutory mandates. So there remains work to be done to ensure decision-grade transparency. And we have a white paper at Cicero called A Standard for Fiscal Transparency in Government that you can reference as well. In Kansas, what we found is that the expenditures dashboard can be broken down by program, but no further. And there are no join links between contracts and payments. The contracting portal, while there are contracts listed, there's no easy way to download all of those different documents. And they could be provided instead in a standard XML or CSV format that would make analysis easier and oversight more straightforward. One thing that I did find in Kansas that is not, it's kind of a novel concept, is that you have the agency performance measures to highlight objectives and functions of each agency, which would be neat to link back to appropriations and then have all in one place. So you currently list out some of the objectives of each of the agencies or programs and how they're doing, like how many people they're serving, or how many people have been trained, or how much it cost per one of whatever one of their actions might be. But then tying that to the appropriation so you can actually see the funding that was associated with each of those actions would be really neat. And while every agency's top stated goals are also listed, along with what functions would be lost should they cease to exist, again, their expenditures are not simultaneously linked. The Rundown podcast, hosted by your very own Division of Post Audit, I found highlighted discrepancies between comprehensive written policies versus their implementation in practice. So moving on to the cost of limited outcome visibility. Public trust erodes when taxpayers cannot trace dollars to results, and I imagine that you've experienced this yourselves. And recent scandals have exposed this persisting failure. In Minnesota, to bring it up once again, the Feeding Our Future case involved roughly $250 million in alleged stolen child nutrition funds routed through a nonprofit network. This vulnerability is not just confined to Minnesota or just that program. The Government Accountability Office reports an estimated $162 billion in improper payments across the federal government in 2024. And since 2003, improper payment estimates total about $2.8 trillion from the federal government. Now, while high-profile fraud cases make the problem obvious in this case, and while fraud is real, costly, and diverts funds from their intended purpose, it's often not the largest problem. Legal waste occurs when spending complies with the rules, satisfies documentation, passes audits, and yet delivers little or no measurable public results or value. When grant requirements are largely procedural, focused on eligibility and paperwork rather than outcomes, recipients can spend fully within the rules while producing low social value. And in those systems, we don't reward program excellence, we reward paperwork excellence, which really isn't the point. And this persists not because of bad intent, but because outcomes are hard to see. Limited outcome visibility allows ineffective programs to persist unchallenged, even under full compliance. And I want to discuss federal pass-throughs as well, because they make this challenge even more urgent. Large volumes of federal dollars flow through Kansas agencies to third-party providers, and like that case in Minnesota that we just discussed. From a legislative perspective, there are three basic questions that are often difficult to answer in one place. That's first, where are federal funds routed? The second are, under what terms are they spent? And third, what outcomes are those dollars producing for Kansans? In the most recent annual audit performed by the Office of Accounts and Reports, your very own office, notes include for some of the contracts that, and I quote, procedures and controls were not sufficient to ensure that it verified that subrecipients were audited in accordance with the requisite standards, such that there is an increased risk that subrecipients could be inappropriately spending and or inaccurately tracking and reporting federal funds over multiple year periods. And these discrepancies may not be properly monitored, detected, and corrected by management on a timely basis.
Elena,
Yes.
could you please repeat the source of that?
Yes, that's from the most recent Office of Accounts and Reports. I can, after this, I can send you
Okay.
that report. That's from the
Thank
state.
you.
That's a state audit from last year, 2020, I believe 5, maybe 2024.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. And compliance with federal requirements also doesn't automatically give state-led lawmakers the visibility they need to govern effectively. So end-to-end transparency, just again to reiterate, that is how federal dollars and state dollars become legible so that they're not just compliant but governable. Thank you for your question. The next slide, oversight levers for better outcomes. I want to turn now to 4 practical oversight practices that this committee could advance. They're realistic and compatible with what Kansas already does. and in the interest of asserting legislative oversight. Moving from procedure, but moving toward quality of outputs. So the first is outcome-based grants, an example of which is pay for performance, which ties payments to clear deliverables and measurable outcomes. And this is building on the performance-based budgeting that you already have instituted. The second is building into the budget oversight for programs from the beginning. This means adequate monitoring, auditing, and data infrastructure should be treated as part of the true cost of running the program, not an afterthought. The third is risk-based NGO or nonprofit screening and monitoring, so that there's standardized pre-award due diligence, ongoing monitoring proportional to risk, and consistent identifiers so we can follow the money across agencies. And fourth, incentives for detection, where we create aligned incentives for auditors or oversight partners to surface improper payments and recover funds, with necessary guardrails in place to make sure that the audits that are being performed are a good use of resources. Moving to the first, outcomes-based grants, of which pay for performance is one example. Most grant funding is eligibility and compliance-based, and funds are therefore released based on approved plans or schedules, and adjusting for underperformance after the fact is often difficult. So with an outcomes-based grant, we then link payments to clearly defined measurable deliverables aligned with legislative intent, with milestone-based disbursements that structure payments around verified progress and results rather than large upfront disbursements. And then there are enforceable performance terms that standardize processes for corrective action and eligibility restrictions when performance benchmarks are not met. To the next slide with a little bit more detail on this policy proposal. The proposed framework is that funding is released again in phases after specific milestones are verified with ramp up for success. So this means providing all overhead or all operational costs and then some percentage above that, with a final percentage, say 30%, saved for at the end once specific metrics or milestones have been hit. So most of the funds would still be given upfront, because in order to actually provide whatever the services are, those certain resources do need to be provided, but saving some amount for the end. Or having automatic and built-in holdbacks and eligibility consequences if performance benchmarks are not met. Often what happens if a benchmark is not hit, the next, there's some sort of repercussion in the given year, but there are no long-term consequences. And we want to incentivize good reporting from all of the organizations that are receiving state funds. They're providing a public service and they're using state dollars to do that. And so it's important that they are complying with all of the requirements. And if they're not, that there are longer term consequences for that. So they don't just receive funds the next year, or that there are some standards put in place that your committee would then therefore decide. The next point proposal I'd like to mention is building in budget oversight for the program from upfront. So having oversight, monitoring, and data infrastructure, often they're not treated as overhead, and that's what we're proposing here, because in reality, they are part of running a program well. They're part of the true cost of that. So we're building oversight into the program design, and that means allocating funding for that infrastructure as a defined share of total program costs, not as an afterthought. And one way to do this very simply is that having reporting requirements that are standardized and quantitative, and that must be met prior to dispersing funds over time, that alone can do a lot to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. And the payoff is that for large programs, even a modest investment, say 1% to 2%, can materially improve accountability and confidence that funds are achieving intended purposes. And oversight protects outcomes. So when we have reliable monitoring, safeguarding both taxpayer dollars and program effectiveness, that is the goal. To the next slide with a little bit more detail. Again, this is that every dollar appropriated includes dedicated funding for oversight. So that's built into the budget. And then it also, another component of the budget that would make this streamlined is that funding for clean data pipelines and standardized machine readable reporting that feed into a transparency portal would be included, again, in all of these line item appropriations from the beginning. Now, not all grantees pose the same risk. So when we're looking at risk-based screening and monitoring, that means that we want oversight resources to be allocated accordingly, which means standardized due diligence. So we use entity IDs to track recipients across all state agencies. It means risk triaging. So we're using public data like IRS 990 forms, USA spending, Kansas Secretary of State data, corporate registries to flag high-risk NGOs before awards are made. And there's proportional monitoring, so there's a focus. We can therefore focus heavy auditing on high-risk streams and lighten the load for proven providers. Now, we're not taking on an attitude of assuming bad actors in this case. We're ensuring attention is focused where it's most needed. And the proposal, again, here is cross-agency entity IDs, ensuring a single clear history for every recipient. So you can see all of the funding that they've received across all agencies and all of their history. So if they were non-compliant with one agency, another agency would be able to see that up front. And then we also want data-driven flags. So this is, for example, IRS 990 issues that trigger deeper audits. And we want all of that to be visible in one place. Finally, fraud and misuse are often first seen by people closest to the problem, and aligned incentives matter so that they will act. Kansans can strengthen detection by aligning incentives to identify, report, and recover improper payments. This is something, to bring it up again, that we saw in the Minnesota case. And the mechanism at play is allowing a defined share of recovered funds to support auditors or oversight partners who materially assist in recovery. And we do want guardrails, again, to apply clear thresholds and standards to focus on material fraud and prevent frivolous or overly aggressive enforcement. We want them focused on where enforcement matters the most and where oversight matters the most. The goal here, again, is earlier detection and higher recovery. And the proposal is 1, ensuring oversight partners have a defined stake in identifying and helping recover misspent funds, and 2, a portion of those recovered dollars offsetting the cost of detection and enforcement. Now, policy ideas matter in practice, but turning to oversight tools in practice, the implementation requires tools. And that's what I'd like to talk to you a little bit more at just the end of this about. This section describes 2 practical instruments that we've built that can operationalize the transparency principles outlined above. The first is a risk-based grantee screening dashboard. And I don't have it up on the screen, but if you go to ngotransparency.org, it's being built out as we speak. It does not include Kansas currently, but as a proposal, which we can discuss after, we will continue to build out all of the states, and Kansas can be a priority there. And the concept of this tool is one that aggregates public data. So it takes spending data, state registries, IRS Form 990s, audit findings to flag risk patterns. And this is for NGO payments. And this is not a final adjudication tool, it's a triage tool, and it's a way to prioritize limited monitoring resources toward higher risk situations. And it flags a few things, including financial distress indicators from 990 filings. It flags governance red flags, it flags past performance issues and anomalous patterns. And there are some guardrails around it as well. Again, flags require human review before action. The methodology should be transparent. So flagged entities deserve due process. We want to make sure that's the case. And this tool is to help humans make better decisions, not to automate decisions without accountability. And this is where we would have a partnership opportunity. So we're developing a prototype of this tool in partnership with Fleet Health that uses publicly available data to generate risk indicators for nonprofit organizations receiving government funds. And we'd welcome the opportunity to demonstrate this tool to the committee and explore a pilot focused on Kansas data. The second tool I'd like to discuss, if you move to the next slide, is a transaction spending portal. And if you go online to ks.gov, it's also available live there. The concept for this is a public-facing dashboard that allows drill down from agency tools to programs to awards to individual payments to vendors and receipts. And the model that this screenshot is based off of is the Texas Comptroller's Transparency Portal, which enables citizens and legislators, so it means the legislators themselves, you can go look and see what all the payments are to trace spending from the highest level of aggregation down to specific transactions. It enables a few things. Again, legislators can answer their own questions without waiting for agency reports or special data requests. There's also public accountability built in because citizens or journalists can do their own oversight work without navigating multiple disconnected systems. Agency incentive alignment is there because when spending data is public, agencies have stronger incentives to ensure data quality and address problems early on. And in Kansas, you publish state contracts, but grant awards are not centralized in a comparable portal. And they're also not in an easily downloadable format. So there's no single location where a citizen or a legislator can see all state funding flowing to external organizations, let alone drill down to individual payments and outcomes. And if you were to build something like this that they've done in Texas, you'd be able to see all of those things. And both tools do the same thing. This tool and the last one that I discussed, they turn existing data into actionable oversight. So we have a few prototype opportunities. And the opportunity before this committee is to build a transparency system that meets the above standards to give you, as legislators, the information that you need to appropriate wisely, that also gives agencies the feedback they need to manage effectively, and then gives citizens the visibility they need to hold the government accountable. And two of these are listed on the slide, standing up a pilot portal and risk triage workflow with a focus on high-risk funding streams and federal pass-throughs. That could be the first priority to build out as part of this. And the second is defining a minimal transparency data standard. And that means clearly identifying all of the different components of payments, contracts, and grants that we need in order to link them so that you can see the funding flow through again from appropriations to final output. And this is more straightforward than it might sound. As I mentioned earlier, having end-to-end transparency is quite achievable and affordable. In the Kansas context, the legislative post-audit has flagged weaknesses and inconsistencies in award processes and documentation in certain funding categories, and I'll send over after this the link to the last year's audit that I mentioned earlier. But these recommendations are designed to address those structural issues permanently. So COGE's focus on efficiency, transparency, and public input creates an opportunity to turn interest into durable standards and infrastructure. And we would welcome the opportunity to partner with this committee on a short prototype sprint to define a minimal transparency data standard and risk triage workflow focused on the highest risk funding streams, including federal pass-through dollars, if that was of interest. We're also very interested in hearing from you on pain points that you've come across since the inception of this committee in procuring and reconciling data from across the state. Efficiency requires visibility, effectiveness requires accountability, and both depend on transparency from appropriation to outcome. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much. Boy, you've given us a lot of food for thought, some concepts that I was not familiar with, but I think we've kind of known that frameworks like this are available, but just couldn't put our finger on it. So I appreciate it, and I think here in Kansas, if we're looking at the fix, I love end-to-end transparency because I think we get about halfway down that. I mean, we appropriate it, we award it, we disperse the funds, and then we never know if it achieves the desired result. So I love that end-to-end transparency, and I also love the concept of having disbursements kind of stepped out depending on when they hit certain benchmarks. Yeah, so some great ideas. But committee, what questions do we have for Elena? Senator Murphy.
Not really a question so much as maybe a comment in relation to all this and the things we've been looking into. There's a big difference between effectiveness and efficiency. We can be really efficient at building wagon wheels and buggy whips, but we don't really need them. So I guess in my district, we do need them, but anyway, no, I think this is the sort of thing that that really looks interesting. It's kind of right up our alley to really help some, because I think there's a lot of money gets wasted that it's a good, well-intentioned, but it gets all chewed up in the process, and the end result is not that good. So I appreciate this opportunity.
Senator Thomas.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, I think a lot of times we get information that can be viewed as slightly favorable one way or another. And so to have sort of that third-party entity to just break it down and say, look, these are the sheer numbers. This is what was spent. This was what wasn't. This is where we detect fraud and abuse. And instead of us as legislators spending all this time diving into it and trying to figure it out and getting reports that get analyzed, I think the idea behind it will save us a lot of hassle and also sort of eliminate that thought process of having a bias one way or another when reports and numbers come out. So just my 2 cents.
Senator Alley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would this type of process help us with, your budgets? All of a sudden, you get carryovers. We didn't spend all this money last year, so we're going to carry this money over. Maybe did they complete the project during that time? Or are they 50% of the project and spend 75% of the money? We don't know because we don't monitor that after we award. So I think this type of process to give us a little more visibility into where we are on the project and is it accomplishing what we intended it to do.
So Elena, can you share with us maybe if you know some of the benefits that Texas has garnered from using this process? Can you share with us some of the things they've identified, how it's worked for them?
Yes, so there are two different, so end-to-end transparency as a whole is in the process of being implemented here. But the two tools that I mentioned have both had benefits. The first tool, well, the order doesn't really matter, but the tool that allows you to see all payments, grants, um, and all of the money that is flowing from state agencies. It's actually really neat. If you do go to ks.gov, you'll be able to look at all of the different agencies' money, and you can see the different appropriations funds. So you can look up, say, A&M and some of the different funds that fall under it, and you can see exactly where those dollars are going and the payments that are being made at a very granular level, which is, I would say that it is useful for the general public to see, but it's also very useful for state legislators and those agencies to understand where their own dollars are going. And maybe if you work for a different university system, it's useful to then be able to see how other university systems' payments are being used in that context. And again, I mentioned also for the auditing tool, which wasn't one of the last two that I mentioned, but one of my colleagues built out an auditing model that basically flagged high risk payments. And not all of those payments, some of the payments that it flagged were, they were suspicious because they were dispersed on a weekend, and you're wondering, why is somebody making a payment on a weekend? Everything should be, you shouldn't be working, or clothes should be closed. But then there was a reasonable explanation. Someone was out on a Friday, they still wanted to close it out before Monday came around, and so someone came in and did a little bit of work on the weekend. And there were easy explanations for those. And then in other cases, there were not, and so they were able to identify high risk payments that the auditors were then able to prioritize when they went to the different agencies to investigate and ask further questions. They were able to prioritize that. And then the agencies also knew that, I think it sets a good expectation for the agencies to know auditors are looking for things that are suspicious. They're actually actively involved. Often there's very limited discretionary auditing capacity. There's certain auditing that they have to do, and then maybe only 3% that they actually get to decide themselves, which is just not very much. And so if you build in some of these processes, like the end-to-end transparency, actually makes it easier for auditors to do their job so they can do more discretionary auditing. And then that discretionary auditing also has a higher impact.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for the presentation. Seems like to me, and we've looked at this with the SNAP payments and everything else, the federal dollars are difficult to track. So some help with that, I think, would be extremely useful for us to try to see, where's it going? What, and maybe it's a good question for our presenter. Or, strings attached to federal dollars. How's that impacting us? Are we spending more because we're having to comply with certain federal regulations to get certain money? I don't know if they track that sort of thing or not, but it would be interesting to know.
Elena, do you know, does it track kind of the requirements on the federal funds, or is it just simply showing the amount and where they flow?
So this is something that is a little tricky, and I'd be curious to know if you know any more. But one thing that we found, not just in Kansas, but in other states also, is that it is quite difficult to track this. So I don't have a super concrete answer for you, but part of that is exactly the problem that we're identifying here and why transparency is so important. That quote that I gave earlier from the Kansas Office of Accounts and Reports, the state audit last year, was actually with regard to a federal grant or federal funds that were being passed through one of the agencies in Kansas. And then that agency had not done, or they had not implemented appropriate oversight measures. But in fairness, it's probably quite difficult for that state agency to, with the current state of data, perform all of those oversight measures.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Anything else for Elena? Well, I hope this is just the beginning of a great conversation around transparency and how we may be able to utilize tools that you are obviously looking at and working on that I think we've been kind of searching for. And again, it's incumbent upon us, once we know that, what are we going to do about it? We're at that point, so thank you so much for being here. And do we have your contact information? Is it on the slides? Or we know that Tyler, our committee assistant, can get in touch with you if we need further information. But thank you so much for being here. Committee, that concludes our business for today. We are adjourned.
Thank you again.